My name is James Holloway, and until 9:14 on a Tuesday morning, I believed that 22 years of building something from nothing meant you were untouchable. I was wrong. That Tuesday started the way most of my Tuesdays started: coffee at my desk before anyone else arrived, reviewing the account activity from the overnight reports, checking in on the 3 or 4 client relationships that always needed some kind of quiet maintenance. I had been doing this long enough that the work felt less like a job and more like tending a garden I had planted myself. You learn the rhythms of it. You know which clients call when something is wrong before they actually call. You know which accounts are fragile in ways that never show up on a spreadsheet. I had built that kind of knowledge over 2 decades at Meridian Freight Solutions, and I wore it the way some men wear a watch, not to show anyone, just because it was useful and it was mine. Meridian was a mid-size logistics and supply chain firm based out of Columbus, Ohio. We were not the biggest name in the industry, but we had something that mattered more than size. We had relationships, long ones. The kind where a client's VP of operations calls you on your personal cell when they have a problem at midnight because they know you will actually pick up. I had spent the better part of 2 decades cultivating exactly that kind of trust, and the numbers reflected it. The accounts I personally managed represented just over $18 million in annual revenue, roughly 34% of the company's total book of business. My salary at the time was $285,000 plus a performance bonus that usually landed around $40,000. When I ran the math, which I had done more than once just out of curiosity, my total compensation represented less than 2% of the revenue I was directly responsible for keeping. That context matters. Keep it in mind. The CFO arrived at Meridian in January. His name was Derek Walsh, and he came from a consulting background, the kind of background where you learn to look at a company as a collection of line items rather than a collection of people. He was brought in by our new ownership group, a private equity firm out of Chicago that had acquired Meridian 8 months earlier. The stated goal was operational efficiency. What that actually meant became clear over the following weeks. My first real conversation with him lasted about 6 minutes. He shook my hand, asked me how long I had been with the company, nodded when I told him, and then said something I filed away without fully processing at the time. There's a lot of legacy cost structure here that we're going to need to revisit. I thought he was talking about software systems or warehouse contracts. I did not understand yet that he was talking about people. Over the following weeks, I noticed the meetings I was not being invited to. Not aggressively, nobody was openly excluding me, but there were conversations happening in conference rooms I used to walk into without knocking, and now the doors were closed. My direct manager, a man I had worked alongside for 11 years, started giving me shorter answers than usual. Not cold, just careful. The way people get careful when they know something you don't and are not yet allowed to tell you. I found out what it was on that Tuesday in March. The email came at 8:47 a.m., inviting me to an operational alignment meeting at 9. 0 inches the main conference room, 13 minutes notice. I brought my coffee, took my usual seat near the window, and watched the room fill up with people I recognized: department heads, senior managers, and 3 faces I did not know who turned out to be members of the consulting team the new ownership had brought in to assist with what the agenda described as compensation restructuring analysis. Derek opened the meeting himself. He thanked everyone for being there, used the phrase transformational moment twice in the first 90 seconds, and then moved to the presentation on the screen behind him. The first several slides were about industry benchmarking data. Average compensation ranges by role, regional cost comparisons, something about market-aligned talent strategy. I was listening the way you listen to something that does not yet feel relevant to you personally. And then the slide changed. My name was on it. James Holloway, Senior Director, Client Partnerships, and next to my name, my full compensation package, base salary, bonus structure, benefits valuation, total annual cost to the company. Every number, displayed in a font large enough to read from the back of the room, in a presentation being viewed by 11 people I worked with every day. Derek did not pause before speaking. He said, "This is an example of the kind of legacy compensation we're addressing. James is compensated at 62% above the market benchmark for his role classification. When we look at what comparable directors at firms our size are earning, this represents a significant structural inefficiency." The room was very quiet. I am not someone who loses composure easily. I have been in high-stakes conversations for a long time, and I have learned that the first thing you should protect in any difficult moment is your own stillness. So I sat there for a moment and I looked at my name on that screen and I thought very clearly about what was actually happening. This was not a conversation. This was not a negotiation. This was a public declaration made in front of my colleagues that I was a problem to be solved. I looked at Derek and I said, "Can I ask what methodology you used to determine that role classification?" He said, "The benchmarking is based on standardized director-level positions in regional logistics firms." I said, "And does that benchmark account for revenue responsibility? Because the accounts I manage generated $18.3 million last year." He said, "The analysis is focused on role structure, not individual performance." I said, "Then the analysis is missing the most important variable." Someone in the room made a small sound. Derek moved to the next slide. I sat there for another moment and I made a decision. Not an emotional one, I want to be clear about that. It was actually a very calm decision, the kind you make when you have been given enough information to understand exactly where you stand. I understood that this meeting was not the beginning of a conversation about my value. It was the announcement of a conclusion that had already been reached. And I understood that I was being asked, in front of 11 colleagues, to accept the premise that I was overpaid, that 2 decades of relationship building and revenue generation could be reduced to a line item that somebody with a consulting background had decided was inefficient. I picked up my coffee. I pushed my chair back. I stood up, and I said, "I don't think I have anything useful to contribute to this meeting." And I walked out. Not stormed out, walked, calmly, with my coffee, the way you leave a meeting that is simply concluded. I went back to my office. I sat down. I called my wife, and I told her what had happened, and I told her what I was going to do next. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Okay, then do it." I want to tell you about a conversation I had had 4 months earlier, because it matters to what comes next. In November of the previous year, I had been approached by a competitor, a firm called Ascent Logistics Group, based out of Cincinnati. They had been trying to build out their enterprise client division, and someone there knew my reputation well enough to reach out directly. The offer they made was significant: a VP title, a compensation structure better than what I had at Meridian, and what they described as genuine autonomy to build the division the way I thought it should be built. I had been flattered, and I had been tempted, and ultimately I had turned it down. I had been at Meridian for 22 years. I had built things there. Walking away from that felt disloyal in a way I could not entirely rationalize away. But I had kept the contact information. Before I did anything else that Tuesday morning, I called the man who had made me the offer. His name is not important, but his title was Chief Revenue Officer, and he picked up on the second ring. I told him I was reconsidering. I asked him directly whether the offer he had extended 4 months ago was still on the table, or whether that door had closed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "James, we have been hoping you would call. Let me get our CEO on a call this afternoon. I want to be honest about something. I did not assume the offer was still valid. I confirmed it first. That phone call happened before I did anything else. I am telling you this because I think it matters, not because it changes the principle of what happened, but because acting on principle without a plan is not courage. It's just impulsiveness. I had spent 22 years building a reputation for being the person who thought before he moved. I was not going to stop doing that because I was angry. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, I had a formal offer letter in my email from Ascent, better than the original offer. They had had 4 months to watch what I was doing at Meridian, and they were not interested in negotiating. I signed it that evening. I submitted my resignation to Meridian the following morning. 2 weeks' notice, as professional as I could make it. Derek's response was a 1-paragraph email that said they would process the transition and wished me well. My direct manager called me within 20 minutes of receiving the news. He sounded like a man who had just been told something he already knew was coming but had hoped would not. He asked if there was anything he could do. I told him I appreciated everything we had built together and that I genuinely wished him well. I meant it. What happened over the next 60 days, I did not engineer. I want to make that absolutely clear. I did not call my clients and tell them what had happened. I did not lobby anyone to follow me. I did not say a single negative word about Meridian to anyone outside the company. What happened because of relationships that had been built over years. And because clients are not stupid, they pay attention to where the people they trust end up. The first call came on my last day at Meridian. One of my longest-standing clients, a regional manufacturing company out of Dayton that I had been working with for 14 years, their VP of supply chain called my cell directly. He said he had heard I was leaving, He asked where I was going. I told him Ascent. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Well, that's going to make my next contract renewal a more interesting conversation." I told him I appreciated the kind words. I did not say anything more than that. Over the following 6 weeks, 11 of the accounts I had managed at Meridian initiated conversations with Ascent. Not all of them moved immediately. Some of them were mid-contract, and some of them wanted to see how things went before making a change. But 11 conversations started within 6 weeks. By the end of the second month, 8 accounts representing just over $9 million in annual revenue had formally transitioned to Ascent. 3 more were in active negotiation. I know what the numbers at Meridian looked like during that period because one of my former colleagues, someone I had mentored for 4 years and who left Meridian voluntarily about 6 weeks after I did, told me what the internal reports were showing. Revenue was down 29% in the first quarter following my departure. By the end of the second quarter, the number had climbed to 34%. The ownership group had brought in additional consultants. There was talk of restructuring the client partnerships division. Several other senior people had quietly updated their resumes. Derek Walsh left Meridian 11 months after I did. The announcement described it as a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities. I am not telling you this because I am happy about any of it. The people at Meridian who lost their jobs when the revenue collapsed were not the ones who had made the decision to put my name on that slide. They were people who had worked hard and who got caught in the downstream effects of a calculation someone else made about what efficiency looks like. I think about them sometimes. It is not a comfortable thing to think about. What I am telling you, because I think it is true and worth saying clearly, is this. When a company decides that the value of a person can be determined by benchmarking their salary against a generic role description, they are making a very specific kind of mistake. They are confusing the cost of replacing someone with the cost of losing them. Those are not the same number. The cost of replacing me at Meridian, in terms of a salary comparison to a market rate director, might have been $100,000 a year. The cost of losing me, as it turned out, was somewhere north of $6 million in annual revenue in the first 12 months alone. I am not saying this to be arrogant. I spent 22 years building those relationships. I earned what I earned because of work that went into years of early mornings and late calls and showing up for clients in ways that had nothing to do with the formal job description. The number on that slide was real. The context that was missing from that slide was also real. And the thing about missing context is that it does not stay missing forever. Eventually, the market fills it in for you. At Ascent, I built the enterprise division the way I had always believed it should be built, around relationships first, transactions second. Within the first year, we brought in $14.2 million in new enterprise revenue. I was named VP of Client Partnerships, and 8 months after joining, I received the company's annual Client Growth Award at our internal conference. It sits on my desk now, next to a photo from a team trip we took to celebrate hitting our first-year numbers. My wife teaches 4th grade. We live in a house we have been in for 16 years, and we are not planning to move. We are not rich in the way that word sometimes gets used to mean private planes and second homes. We are comfortable in the way that actually matters. We do not worry about the things most people worry about, and we have been able to give our kids opportunities that I am grateful for every time I think about them. Whether that constitutes doing well financially is a question I leave to whoever is asking it. What I think about most, when I think about that Tuesday morning, is not the anger. The anger faded faster than I expected. What I think about is the moment I stood up from that table. Not because it was dramatic, it genuinely did not feel dramatic in the moment, but because of what it required. It required being more certain about my own value than the person with the slide deck was. It required trusting 22 years of evidence over a consulting firm's benchmarking model. That is harder than it sounds. We are trained, most of us, to defer to authority, to assume that the person with the presentation knows something we don't, to wonder, when someone tells us we are worth less than we thought, whether maybe they are right. I did not wonder that. Not because I am unusually confident, but because I had the receipts. I knew what those client relationships had taken to build. I knew what they were worth. And I knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from doing something for 22 years, that you cannot benchmark that on a slide. A few months after I joined Ascent, I ran into someone who had been in that conference room. We were at an industry event in Indianapolis, and we ended up at the same table for dinner. He had left Meridian by then, which is why I think he felt comfortable talking openly. He told me that after I walked out, the meeting had effectively ended. Nobody had said anything for almost a full minute. Then someone had asked whether we should continue, and Derek had said yes, and they had moved to the next slide, but that the energy in the room had shifted entirely. He said several people had left the building for lunch that day and spent the break updating their LinkedIn profiles. He also told me something that I have thought about many times since. He said that in the weeks after I left, Derek had told the ownership group that the client losses were a temporary disruption and that revenue would stabilize once new account managers were onboarded and clients had time to evaluate Ascent on its own merits. The ownership group had accepted that explanation for 1 quarter. By the second quarter, they had stopped accepting it. The market is not sentimental. It does not care about organizational charts or benchmarking models or the consulting fees that went into building them. It cares about who picks up the phone when something goes wrong at midnight and whether that person knows what to do. You can put a number next to a name on a slide and call it a cost structure problem. But the number does not capture what happens when that name is no longer in the building. That is something Derek Walsh learned, and it cost a lot of people a great deal more than $100,000 a year to teach it to him. I still start my Tuesdays early. Coffee at my desk before anyone else arrives. Reviewing account activity. Checking in on the relationships that need maintenance. The work has not changed much, in the fundamental sense. What has changed is that I do it somewhere that understands the difference between what something costs and what it is worth. Those are not the same number either. They never are.